Hey, fam, I want you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications. All right, folks, joining us right now is the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, head of the Poor People's Campaign, Repairs of the Breach. Reverend Barber, glad to have you with us on this day where Dr. King was killed 51 years ago.
Well, Roland, certainly really glad to be with you on today and all of your guests. Hello to everyone. I'm actually headed to the monument to speak today at 7 o'clock. You know, I'm certainly glad that Brother Senator Booker and Clyburn have put this bill forward. It's a step. It's proving that the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival, is starting to push the narrative and starting to force these conversations back into the public consciousness. However, you know, it is a step. We're reading the bill because we really are in a moment that we also cannot just have Band-Aid approach. We have to have fundamental reconstruction change. We have 140 million people in this country that live in poverty and low wealth. That's 43.5% of our nation's population. We had a presidential election in 2016. We had debates, both Democrats and Republicans, and not one time did the one debate dedicate itself to something that 43.5% of the people face. Most of the conversation was about middle class and the wealthy. We have, 37 million people without health care, even with the Affordable Care Act. And there was a direct connection between voter suppression and racist gerrymandering and the rolling back of programs that would help the poor that, in fact, hurts mostly white people. There's 66 million poor white people in this country, 60 million, excuse me. Something like 20 million, almost 30 million black people, 40 million more white people in poverty, even though almost 60% of black people are in poverty and low wealth. So this bill is a step, but I am concerned. Number one, when we have to say to our Congress people, stop saying we have limited money.
Right, and in fact, it was very interesting, Doc. Literally, when I heard that, I heard what's in the book at the moment he said that, it wasn't limited when Donald Trump had his trade tariffs and then all of a sudden found $12 billion instantly for those farmers. When they get $700 billion more in defense, and I can go on and on and on, when it was, but it's real quick to find multiple billions, but then all of a sudden, now it's limited.
Right, and that's what Dr. King, that's why he connected racism, poverty, militarism. First of all, the racism, particularly something like voter suppression, allows persons to get elected who then are anti all of the programs that would lift the poor. Number two, poverty, he wanted to broaden it so that we see it was affecting everybody, because oftentimes the language of poverty is used as code word to mean black and brown and lazy and people that are just getting free stuff. But he also added militarism, because right now, 53 cents of every dollar we spend discretionary goes toward the military. Almost $800 billion, 800. That is the resources that go into the military. If you're not willing to address that and not willing to address that we are putting only 15 cents into issues that in the areas that would help the poor and lift people up in education, but 53 cents, and by the time Donald Trump gets finished, it's going to be 62 cents, then you're not really serious. We have to challenge outright this issue of scarcity. We do not have a scarcity of resources. We have a scarcity of will, compassion, and moral ability to transform these issues. And lastly, Roland, we can't just talk about people that have been in poverty 30 years. It doesn't matter. What about communities that have been in poverty 15 years or 10 years? There's 140 million people. What we need is a omnibus bill, a massive transformation. That's what the Poor People's Campaign is putting forward. I just left the Capitol with Speaker Pelosi calling for, with my co-chair, a major hearing on poverty, and that we want to present people and issues and policies. Got to talk about living wages. Got to talk about guaranteed income for the poor. Got to talk about health care for everybody. Got to talk about this money, too much money going into militarism. Got to talk about environmental justice. It cannot be one thing, but this is a good step to at least get the conversation. But we have to change the narrative even further than it's being changed with this piece of legislation.
And Reverend Barber, also, I think it's critically important that we don't allow people to pimp Dr. King and his name and what he stood for by limiting him to a couple of speeches. I think anytime any politician utters a single quote of Dr. King, we should stand up. We should stand up and say, no, 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 no. Where are you standing on his policies? Where are you standing on how he lived? See, that's why I've been, for the last 5 years, everywhere I go in this country, I've been telling folks they need to buy his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community,
exactly.
because he literally laid this whole thing out in his own words, and there's no shock. It was first his worst-selling book of his life, and this book wasn't published for 10 years after his death. There was a reason for that.
Exactly, and that's why in the Poor People's Campaign, following his lead, we've created something called the Souls of Poor Folk Auditing America 50 Years After, that gives the stats and also the policies. That's why we got 40 coordinating committees now, 41 states, including the District of Columbia. That's why today, last 2 weeks ago, we started massive bus tours across this country with the media in tow. We're getting ready to have a Poor People's Moral Action Congress in June. We're going to continue to ramp up our nonviolent direct action around these issues. This is not a game, Martin. Dr. King said last night would have been the night he preached his last sermon. And, you know, let's be real. After 67, civil rights organizations left him.
Yep.
Unions left him. Churches left him. They walked away from him when he put these three theses out there. And people have been trying to kind of play around that legacy ever since. But 51 years ago last night, Dr. King said, America, listen, is a sick nation, and nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. I think in some ways that's the most powerful thing he said. Sure, he talked about going to the mountaintop, looking over, I've seen the problems. But in that speech, before he got to that, he said nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. And that's the kind of fortitude commitment that we must encourage, we must have today. Lastly, Roland, I was reading I had to go back and read the Declaration of Independence today. And you know, Declaration of Independence says anytime, in essence, that a nation is moving away from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all people, we have a responsibility to alter that nation. It is altering time. It is time for us to alter the direction of this nation, because 43.5% of this nation live every day in poverty and low wealth in the richest nation in the country. And as Jesus said about the fig tree, it's a damn shame.
Joseph.
So, Dr. Barber, nice to talk to you. I have two questions. The first is, your Moral Mondays were really impressive in that you got a multiracial coalition going to the state capitol, protesting a range of issues, not just poverty. I want to know, number one, how are you able to connect that with Trump voters, and are you able to convince rural white Americans that these things that happen in the cities are both connected to them and are in their best interests? And the second is, are you able to tie this sort of a movement to voting? Talk about how you're able to do that.
Yeah. Well, number one, on your first question, we've gone from eastern Kentucky, to Alabama. We've gone from West Virginia up in the coal mines with white people down to Mississippi. Our coalition with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival, is every race, color, creed, sexuality in this country. And the way we have found it is unity has to come through truth. That's why we don't use the government's number for poverty. That's why we don't say there's a scarcity, because we know the history. That was Lee Atwater's fourth pillar of the Southern strategy, to use tax cuts as a form of racial code word. We go into these communities. First of all, you got to go there. You got to go among people. And then when we go there, we actually show them the connection between voter suppression and who gets elected. And the sad and ugly truth is the people that use racialized voter suppression to get elected, when they pass policies, they hurt mostly white people. We show them the connection between that and poverty, and that and the lack of living wages. Like all the southern states, for instance, are the highest in voter suppression, the lowest in wages, the lowest in insurance coverage, the greatest in the attack on immigrants. We believe in our campaign, as Dr. King did, that people can handle the truth. And in fact, they need the truth. And the reason why we frame it as a moral movement, even now, is because that left-right language is too puny. That's why we had 6 weeks of direct action last spring. And we're not finished with that, to push these issues forward. Now, on the voting piece, we know for a fact that the so-called Republicans, I call them extremists, developed a strategy that's how they could control the government without having a majority. And that would be through voter suppression and racialized gerrymandering. But we also know that Democrats have refused to go organize in the South at the very time that the South is fundamentally open for change, because now it's 40% people of color. And if we organized in the South and brought poor and progressive whites into the fold along with brown people, we could change 4 or 5 southern states tomorrow, and you only need to change about 2 or 3 to change the whole climate of politics in America. And so what we're doing is we're registering people for the movement who will vote with a certain politicization. And that's why we're doing these movements and growing bus tours and hearings and other things all across this country. And that is why we talk about 5 interlocking injustices. If you want a third Reconstruction, you have to address systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy and militarism, and the false moral narrative of Christian evangelism and Christian nationalism, all together. They are interlocking injustices that you can't separate. You have to address them together.
Greg?
Good evening, Reverend Barber. I always enjoy talking to you, brother. 2 very quick questions. Number one, we know Donald Trump has already replaced 1/5 of the federal judiciary. We know the wars that you've waged in North Carolina and beyond. I think about something Dr. King said, Harry Belafonte, and Belafonte has said many times, including in interviews with our brother Roland. I fear I'm integrating my people into a burning house. How do we address the ultimate strategy of white nationalists like Mitch McConnell to basically say, if we can get the judiciary, we will ride this until the wheels fall off? And then the other question, just a broad question, since this is a moral movement, and since Dr. King was a prophetic voice, not a politician, do we in fact envision a future where it may not be that there is a United States of America, and if the country must be sacrificed and ultimately for the people to advance, what might it look like if we just even think that even the U.S. is not our goal? Ultimately, truth is our goal.
Well, ultimately, in a prophetic movement, truth and justice has to be the goal. I think we're at a point where the question is now, not can the Democratic Party be or the Republican Party be, but can America be?
That's right.
I mean, when 50-some years after the Voting Rights Act, you have less voting rights than you had 50-some years ago, that's a serious question. Can America be? Today, as we're here today, it's been 2,091 days, I believe, since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, and the Republican Congress has refused to act on it. But not only that, we also have progressives and Democrats often who are so willing to compromise, sometimes they can't stand true on anything. So I think we're in a third Reconstruction kind of moment, and the question really is, can America be? Now, how do we address Trumpism and white nationalism? First of all, I think we have to stop just saying Trump. Trump is at what Neil Painter called it iconography of a too often repeated American reality. He's like when you have a cold, you sneeze. What comes out your nose ain't the cold, ain't the problem. It's the symptom of the problem. You got to go deeper in the system. So the ground was laid for Trump in 2010 when 26 states passed voter suppression. We have to target the enablers. He couldn't do a thing if McConnell and them didn't go to nuclear options when it comes to the courts. And that is why we must build state-based movements from the bottom up. It's nationalizing state movements, not just having a national movement from the top down, which is what we're trying to do in this campaign. But I think we have to fight for the soul of this nation because too many of our foreparents fought for it and died for it. And I'm not willing to just let something go that my grandmama bled for or my father or my grandfather bled for. But I do think we are really in a fight for whether or not America can be. And that is why we have to have a prophetic, long-term moral movement that's intersectional, intergenerational, interracial, intergender, intersectional, all of those things that will stay at this. Because right now, the narrative is so narrow That's why I love what Roland is doing on this show, because right now in most of the media, the narrative is so left, right, conservative, liberal. It's so shallow, it's puny, it's anemic. It doesn't even help people understand what's really going on. And that, because of that and many other things, we had 100 million people that didn't even vote last time they were eligible. 100 million. You know, we had in Wisconsin, for instance, Trump wins by 30,000 votes. He had 250,000 votes suppressed. You know, we have somebody in office who didn't win, but even those of us some people who know that, they still say he won. We keep legitimizing that which is illegitimate. And I think the time has come that we have to stop really having a resistance, but having an offensive, and begin to move and fight for the heart and soul of this country. Not just for a party, not just for a president, but literally for the reality and existence of this country, insofar as what it has promised, but it has never fulfilled yet, but we can't give up on either.
Last question, Julianne Evo.
Reverend Barber, you know I love you dearly. I'm so glad to hear your voice. I want to take this to an economic perspective, because as people have said, when you elect a clown, you should expect a circus. And we do not pay attention to the sideshow. Part of the sideshow are the appointments that are being made, like the Federal Reserve Bank. The Fed has the opportunity to do things with the interest rate. Now he's got some clown more that he wants to appoint, and also Herbert Kane. He's lifted his name. He doesn't know the Fed from a hole in the wall. And I'm cleaning it up because I'm talking to you. You know that. I always clean up when I talk to you. So, but Rev, how can we activists begin to deal with the Fed and with what the Federal Reserve Bank does and how that affects the terms and conditions of our everyday life?
Well, I think the first thing is you raised is from an economic standpoint. We have to begin to really drill down on these economic issues and really teach what is going on. No, so much is not known. You know, sometimes I go to places and now folk are talking about stuff, and sometimes I don't want to say it's trivial, but it is. You know, when you live in a nation, Julianne, where 62 million people make less than a living wage.
Yes.
And we are arresting people who fight for 15 and a union. But 400 families make an average of $97,000 an hour in a democracy. When we look at the fact, and this is a framework that I think Roland and I talked about, you know, this $1 trillion tax cut was not just a tax cut for the wealthy. It was that. But it also was the largest transfer of money from the back of working people since slavery. In fact, one way you can look at it, more money was transferred in that tax cut to the wealthy than was transferred through slavery. And nobody mentioned that. Nobody talked about the budget that as a racist, you know, transfer of wealth, as well as a class problem. So when we look at this issue of how interest rates are used, how interest rates enable the ownership of homes or the ownership of land, and how it also can keep those things from happening, we have to have our best economists like you and others school us on those realities, and then make sure that we are in the fight for those things. We cannot just be in the fight, say, for what is deemed civil rights, like voting rights. We have to be engaged in the monetary and fiscal policies of this nation. And let's be clear. Racism, genocide, and slavery was always about money and the interest rate. Jim Crow was always about money and the interest rate, who got what, when, where, and how, and the fiscal policies of this nation. There's a book now that says we've made the mistake of thinking that the ignorance about race came first. The author says no. The decision to use people for economic growth, even if it was in an inhumane and immoral way, came first. Then the cultural racism to justify it came second. I like to say, once folks decided you needed a certain people that you could make money off of and benefit the country without them getting any benefit, you had to have, then you had to develop a system of bad biology, that their color, their skin determine the size of their brain, sick sociology, that couldn't be around other people, evil economics, the end means justifies the end, and then you had to have what I call a heretical ontology, and that is that God meant it to be this way. And so, Julianne, I think, and I'm going to put this back on Roland and all of you all, I think you and some others and our best economists ought to do several shows. We'll get everybody we can. I think ought to do a traveling circuit on it, on what's really happened with monetary and fiscal policy. Because we could end up with this, Roland. This scares me more than anything.
Right.
We could end up with a majority black, brown, and progressive white electorate that elects progressive folk to a broke bank country.
That's right.
Ooh.
They could have stolen everything,
That's
and
right.
then you end up handing the power. Similar to what happened in South Africa.
Yep.
Right? Similar to what happened in South Africa.
Yes.
You end up getting the political power, but before you get it, they steal everything from it, rob the bank, transfer the wealth in such a way that you then have the mechanisms of government, but you don't have the money to make the mechanisms work.
Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, you're going to be live. You're going to be at the monument here in D.C.?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
All
Be
right.
there just a minute.
All right, brother. I certainly appreciate it. Thank you very much for joining us. And, folks, this is, again, you heard Reverend Barber say it, but this is also no other show is having this discussion on this day, which is why I created this, because we got to be able to control our own narrative. Reverend Barber, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Bless your heart.
Filtered. Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. By going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com, you can make this possible.